She rudely spoke to a regular customer, only to find out he was the owner, and he was Clint Eastwood. The midday sun shone brightly through the large windows of Sierra Grill, a simple but busy restaurant in Carmel by the Sea, California. It wasn't a fancy place, but it had a cozy charm, a mix of rustic and modern. Locals loved it, especially on a warm Thursday afternoon. For Megan, a 23-year-old waitress struggling to pay her bills, that charm didn't make her day any easier. Her shift had been a mess from the moment she started. "Table 7 needs extra dressing," another server called. Megan didn't even look up as she scribbled down another order. Her ponytail swung as she rushed between tables, dealing with complaints about undercooked steaks, split checks, and missing drinks. To make things worse, she had already handled 3 rude customers in the past hour, each one leaving her frustrated. Megan couldn't quite place it. "Just a burger," he said calmly, his voice low and gravelly, carrying a weight that seemed to command respect. "Burger, got it. Anything else?" Megan asked, tapping her pen against the notepad. "No, ma'am," he replied. Tipping his hat slightly, she rolled her eyes as she walked back to the kitchen, muttering, "Ma'am? Really?" under her breath. But as she stepped inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about him stood out. He wasn't like the other customers, rude, demanding, or dismissive. There was a quiet confidence about him, almost as if he was watching and waiting for something. Megan shrugged it off. It was just another table, another order, another dollar. But she had no idea just how wrong she was. A few minutes later, she returned to table 12 with the man's burger. The plate clattered onto the table with less care than she usually gave. She was running on fumes, her smile more forced than ever. Megan placed the ketchup bottle next to the man's plate. The man didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't let it show. "Here you go," Megan said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Anything else?" The man glanced at the burger, then back at her. "No, this looks just fine. Thank you." His words were polite, but there was a firmness in his tone that made Megan feel oddly self-conscious. She lingered for a moment, unsure why she hadn't already moved on to the next table. Something about his demeanor annoyed her. Maybe it was the calmness, the unshakable composure. Everyone else in the restaurant was either complaining, snapping their fingers, or rushing around in a frenzy, but not him. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked abruptly, leaning on the edge of the table. She couldn't help herself. "No, I'm not," he replied simply, cutting his burger in half with deliberate precision. "Thought so," she said, smirking again. The hat gave it away. "Looks like you're not either," he replied, his calm eyes meeting hers. He just stepped out of an old Western movie for the first time. The man smiled, not a full grin, but a faint curve of his lips. "Something like that," he said. Megan expected him to get defensive or annoyed, but he didn't, which frustrated her even more. She was tired of being polite, tired of holding back her thoughts. "You know," she said, lowering her voice like sharing a secret, "most people around here don't show up looking like they just came from a ranch." He didn't answer right away, instead taking a measured bite of his burger. After a moment, he simply replied, "I guess I'm not most people." His words were simple, but carried a weight Megan didn't expect, and a flicker of embarrassment crossed her mind, though she quickly buried it. "Well, enjoy your meal," she said, pushing off the table and walking away, sure she'd had the last word. But as she cleared another table nearby, she caught him watching her, not in a creepy way, but with an expression that made her feel like he could see right through her. She felt like she was being evaluated, judged even. It was unsettling, and she couldn't figure out why it bothered her so much. But something about that look would soon change the course of her day and her life in ways she never saw coming. As the lunch rush began to wind down, the restaurant grew quieter, and Megan finally had a chance to catch her breath. She leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone while keeping an eye on her tables. Her gaze flicked to table 12, where the man was finishing his meal. He seemed in no hurry, sipping his water and glancing around the restaurant with quiet curiosity. "Hey, Megan," her coworker Danny said as he walked by. "Isn't it weird how calm that guy is, like he's just taking it all in?" Megan shrugged. "Yeah, well, some people have all the time in the world." Danny chuckled. "Maybe he's famous or something. He looks familiar, doesn't he?" Megan rolled her eyes. "Famous? Yeah, right. If he's famous, then I'm the Queen of England." Danny raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure about that?" Danny raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Megan wasn't in the mood for idle speculation. Instead, she grabbed the check for table 12 and walked over, determined to keep the interaction brief. "Here's your check," she said, placing it on the table with a faint smile. "Whenever you're ready." The man glanced at the check, but didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked up at her, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked, his voice calm but deliberate. The question caught Megan off guard. She hesitated, her practiced smile faltering. "It's fine," she said, with a shrug. "It's a job, you know." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A job's what you make of it," he said after a moment. "But it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Megan felt her cheeks flush. Who was he to comment on her attitude? She crossed her arms defensively. "Look, I've had a rough shift, okay? Not everyone gets to sit around sipping water and watching the world go by." The man, unbothered by Megan's sharp tone, continued eating his burger and offering unsolicited life advice, completely at ease. With a faint smile, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Fair enough. But sometimes, how you treat people in those moments says more about you than you think." A surge of anger rose in Megan's chest. Was he lecturing her? She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the man stood, pulled out his wallet, and set a few bills on the table. "I'll leave you with that thought," he said, then added, "Thanks for the meal." As he walked toward the door, Megan muttered under her breath, "Yeah, whatever, cowboy." She wasn't in the mood for politeness. But just as he reached the exit, something unexpected happened. The manager, Carol, usually a no-nonsense figure who stayed in the back office, hurried out, her face lighting up when she saw the man. She quickly extended her hand with genuine enthusiasm. "Mr. Eastwood, I wasn't expecting you today," she said, her voice filled with respect. Megan's heart sank, and she froze, the realization hitting her with a jolt. Megan's stomach dropped as the name replayed in her head. Eastwood. Clint Eastwood. She whipped her head toward the door, her eyes widening as she saw him turn back briefly to shake Carol's hand. For a moment his eyes caught hers, a knowing look passing between them before he walked out the door. In that instant, Megan realized she hadn't just insulted an unassuming customer. She had insulted the owner of the restaurant. Frozen in place, Megan stood with her notepad tightly clutched in her hand, staring at the door Clint Eastwood had just walked through. Her mind raced. Did she really just brush off Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood, and not only that, but he was also the owner of the restaurant. Her heart started pounding, the weight of her mistake sinking in. Here's the paragraph as requested, as Carol turned toward her. "Megan," she called, waving her over. "Can you believe it? Mr. Eastwood stopped by today. He's been so busy lately, I haven't seen him in weeks." Yeah, that's..." "Wow," Megan stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Carol didn't seem to notice Megan's discomfort. She was too busy gushing. "You know, this place means the world to him. He's so hands-on. Every detail here is something he's personally approved. That's why we're always reminding staff to bring their best. You never know when he'll stop by." Megan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. She replayed every word she'd said to him, every snarky comment, every eye roll. Her cheeks burned with humiliation. "Are you okay?" Danny asked, noticing Megan's pale face. I think I need a minute," Megan muttered, retreating to the break room. As soon as the door closed behind her, she let out a shaky breath and sank into a chair. How could she have been so oblivious? She'd been working at the Sierra Grill for Here's the paragraph you requested. Years had passed, and in all that time, Megan had never bothered to pay attention to the stories about the mysterious owner. If she had, maybe she'd have recognized him, or at least thought twice before running her mouth. Her mind was spinning, but one thought stood out. What now? But Megan had no idea that Clint wasn't done with her just yet. The next day, Megan arrived at work with a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She hadn't slept well, replaying the events of the previous day in her mind. Every time she thought about Clint Eastwood's calm demeanor and the look he gave her as he left, she cringed. What if he told Carol about her attitude? What if she got fired? She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with rent due in 2 weeks and her student loans piling up. She spent the first half of her shift avoiding eye contact with Carol and doing everything she could to keep her customers happy, smiling. Here's the paragraph you requested. Megan spent the rest of the morning apologizing, refilling drinks before anyone even had to ask. It was the most effort she'd put into her job in months. By the time lunch rolled around, the restaurant was humming with activity. Megan was wiping down a table when she heard the unmistakable gravelly voice she hadn't been able to forget. "Well, looks like you're busy today," Clint Eastwood said. She turned sharply to see him standing near the counter, his hands resting casually in his pockets. He was dressed much the same as the day before, but this time his presence felt even more commanding. Her heart sank. She forced a nervous smile, trying to think of what to say. Mr. Eastwood. Hi. I didn't know you'd be back so soon." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I like to check in on my places from time to time. Keeps everyone on their toes." Megan swallowed hard, her palms sweaty. "Right. Well, everything's running great today," he gave a small nod and glanced around the restaurant. "I see that, but you seem a little distracted." "Here's the next part you asked for." Megan froze, realizing he had noticed her tension. Of course he noticed. He probably noticed everything, especially after what happened yesterday. He held up a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "No need to apologize," he said calmly. "I'm not here to make your life harder." She blinked, caught off guard by his response. "You're not?" "No," he said, his voice steady. "But I do think there's a lesson here. You never know who you're talking to or what they might be going through. A little kindness goes a long way." Megan's throat tightened. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded, feeling a lump form in her chest. "Look, I've had bad days too," Clint continued, his tone softening. "But the way you handle those days says a lot about who you are, and trust me, people notice." She could feel her face turning red. His words weren't harsh, but they hit harder than any scolding ever could. He wasn't trying to embarrass her. He was trying to teach her something. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean it." He gave her a small smile. "You're welcome." Felt a shift in her approach. Instead of rushing to clean it up with irritation, she calmly reassured the mom, "Don't worry, we'll get it cleaned up in no time." She smiled softly and took a moment to ask the kids what they wanted to drink, making them feel heard and valued. The change wasn't huge, but it was noticeable. Over time, Megan's interactions became more genuine, more thoughtful. She didn't aim for perfection, but she tried to approach each situation with a bit more understanding and care. She noticed that customers responded better, and even the chaotic lunch rush felt a little more manageable. Megan still had her moments of frustration, but each time Clint's words echoed in her mind, she reminded herself that every moment was an opportunity to do better. By the end of the month, she found herself enjoying her work more, and perhaps more importantly, she started to appreciate the impact she could have, no matter how small it seemed. And when Clint came in again, his quiet presence no longer made her anxious. Instead, it made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path. Megan's heart skipped a beat, her nerves easing slightly at the praise. She hadn't expected this at all. Carol's voice softened as she continued. I can tell you're putting more into your work, and it's showing. Your attitude's made a real difference, not just with the customers, but with the rest of the team too. Megan's breath caught in her throat. The validation felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She hadn't realized how much she craved recognition, or how much her attitude had shifted since Clint had talked to her. I didn't expect that, Megan said, her voice tinged with surprise. Carol smiled warmly. Well, it's deserved. Keep it up, Megan. You're doing great. Megan nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. As she left the office, the words replayed in her mind. It was more than just about making the customers happy. It was about finding a deeper satisfaction in the work she did, and for the first time in a long while, she felt proud of herself. That's a beautiful way to wrap up Megan's journey. It's really powerful how small, seemingly insignificant, moments can spark personal growth and change. The quiet cowboy, Clint Eastwood, turned out to be a pivotal figure in her life, helping her see the value in kindness and patience, not just for others, but for herself. It's a great reminder that we can always improve, and that sometimes the most impactful lessons come from the least expected places. If you're looking to continue or expand on this story, I'd be happy to help.